Moira is a very easy character. But is that a good thing? I think easy characters have their place, but Moira is one of the least engaging characters in the game for either side. So, how do we fix her? How do we make her more engaging for everyone to play with and against? So, Moira is the classic example of a character with a low skill floor and basically a pretty low skill ceiling, too. I actually don't think low skill floors are that bad, but when the character gets all of their value on the lower end of the skill curve, I do think that ends up being a bit of a problem. So before I get into the big reworks, let's just go over a couple of ground rules. One, the numbers, exact numbers, I don't really talk about many of them. I don't want to get caught in the weeds about, balance and anything. Obviously, I can't balance it. So let's just go with some generalizations. I'll say maybe this has a moderate cooldown or this does a small amount of damage, stuff like that. Get in the ballpark. Don't want to get caught up in the semantics of everything. Number two, obviously, I don't have access to any tools to test these things or know how they're going to play. These are obviously all first iterations. I would have no way to know if this kind of works or not. Just kind of like guidance in my head. So if it seems like it may not be feasible or hard to work into the game, I tried to consider that, but at some point, there's not much I can really know about. And third, I'm just going to go ahead and assume that anything is possible. Infinite time, infinite budget, infinite resources, yada, 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 all of that. It's a creative exercise. I want just like the creative juices flowing more than getting, again, caught up in all the little details that would prevent something like this from happening. And also, for this rework in particular, if you've seen any of my other reworks, a lot of times I go pretty hard and I give them completely new abilities, and sometimes the character doesn't even look like they used to. They just have very broad aspects of what makes that character work in the kit. Moira, for this one, not really like that. In fact, I think all of this feasibly could be added into the game or like reworked without having to change any assets or anything like that. I think this wouldn't be too bad to implement or too difficult to implement in the game. In fact, all of her abilities stay the same. At least they're all here. They've all just been tweaked and maybe reworked a little bit. So I wanted to kind of challenge myself this time about like working with what we have. How do I kind of change these characters in a much more reasonable sense of some of the other reworks we've had, more like, the Wrecking Ball rework and Pigpen and Roadhog and all of that. Even though Roadhog even got a new ability. But that's kind of where I'm getting at with this one. So let's go ahead and we'll talk about Moira. So let me make sure. Okay. Moira's game plan is defined by a couple of things: ease of use, swapping resources, and throwing orbs, right? And some survivability. These are all great and make her engaging on a surface level. It's really the execution of these abilities that the flaws lie. Everything in her kit is easy to use and gets almost immediate value in some form or fashion. And I think some elements like this are fine, but basically everything being like this keeps the character down, in my opinion. Think about Kiri. She is a very hard character, but she's still super popular at all play levels, right? Similar to Ana as well. Why? I think it's because she has a good mix of abilities with variable value floors, right? Kunai are hard to hit and get the full value out of, but Suzu really isn't, Even though Suzu is still like a decently skillful ability, you can get a lot of value out of it even if you don't use it to its fullest extent. She can have the impact even if you aren't the best Kiri in the world, but also, lower rank Kiris aren't going to be getting every single possible value out of the character. Basically, as you go up, Kiri is useful in basically any rank. Not to say that Moira can't be optimized, but that's where I think most of the fun... I think that's where most of the fun of this character is. But it has its limits a little bit. Basically, Moira should keep some of her easy-to-use elements, in fact, probably most of them, but I think she should also receive a little more skill in certain areas. So I don't want to make her as hard as Kiri. In fact, I don't think I've made her a very hard character at all, at least on the skill floor level. But I do want to attempt to raise the ceiling a little bit. And again, I don't think I've gone overboard here. So we're going to go ahead and get into the actual rework, starting with primary and secondary fire, which are basically the same. I had a couple ideas for these abilities, but at the end of the day, I think it made Moira too complicated. And again, that was kind of backwards to what I wanted to achieve with this rework. So I'm going to go ahead and keep these as is. You know, I'm totally down to making them just a tiny bit harder to use. Maybe keep the suction in even closer, the tracking. But, you know, I wanted to keep that skill floor and get that like immediate value that Moira's like. I also really do like the resource management of like having the heal resource. I think it's a great moment-to-moment gameplay loop that comes from the primary and secondary fire. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to keep the primary and secondary fire largely the same. You know, obviously if I do my rework, if it were actually real, maybe the numbers come down or up depending on how strong the rest of her kit ends up being. But we're going to go ahead, we'll talk about the Biotic Orb. So there are a couple general changes. Both versions of this are now a decent, like, skill shot. So think of how fast orb travels when it's not affecting anybody. It's gonna go that fast, basically, and they don't activate until they collide with a player on the field. Either an enemy or an ally, okay? So they have no effect until they hit a target. They will stick to whoever they collide with and do different effects depending, and we'll get into that. They'll still bounce off of walls a couple of times as they don't hit anybody, you know, like similar like how long they stay in the air. But basically, each orb has a different effect for if you hit them with allies or if you hit them on enemies. It's no longer the healing and the damage orb. I've kind of renamed them because they've been changed a little bit, but there are aspects of healing and damage in there. Basically, think of this as like, I'm trying to think like, you know, like how hard is it to hit like a BAP right click, like a lob shot. Think of it like that, where you're going to hit most of them, but it's still like a possibility where you don't, right? That's kind of like the general ease of use of this. So it's still a skill shot, but it's not like super hard like trying to hit a kunai, for instance. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start with sorry, the very zoomed in grainy image of the heal orb, which is now what I'm going to call the stable orb. Basically, this one has very similar effects. So if it hits an ally, it's going to do a moderate burst of healing on contact. And then when it's sticking to them, it's going to have just a small, short AoE heal afterwards. So kind of like akin to how much the orb is allowed to do on live. I believe the healing orb resource has like 200 to go around for everybody. Think of it kind of like that, where it's going to do mainly enough, you know, like a moderate burst to one person that it hits, and then it's going to heal a couple people around her at a much lower rate than what heal orb does on live. Basically, so that like if she wants to help a group of people, she can, and she can be there, or she may not be. She could be across the map and still help people. She doesn't have to be like super close or throw orb and like wait for it and hope they get because, you know, orb takes a while to actually get all the value out of it because it has to travel there, and then it's like a over time healing. So this should help her kind of make a play with her healing more so, like kind of saving people with the heal. And also kind of amplify them and help them stay in a fight longer. And the enemy effect, it's going to be very similar, all of that stuff that I just said, but it's a damage, right? Moira is going to have a little bit more burst damage, so she's able to, you know, take duels a little more effectively, but she has to hit the orb in the first place. And, you know, it's decently easy to dodge, so you kind of have to be more skillful with it. And you don't necessarily have to be all up in their face. You could fire it across the map. But even if you spam it, it's not going to do that much overall, because, you know, it's still on a cooldown. It will have the dot effect as well, and that dot, not the burst, only like the damage over time when it's sticking on people, that will give Moira lifesteal. I felt like just giving Moira a big burst of lifesteal, probably a little too much. If Moira were too weak, that could definitely be something that could be added. Basically, It's kind of the same idea that's on live, but it gives her a little more variety in how she uses it, like versatility, but it also exemplifies the playmaking of this ability. I think Moira struggles to truly make plays. And I think that's kind of an issue. And I think just adding, like, shifting the power in her regular kit to something like this, or anything that would allow her to make plays more often, I think is definitely a good thing. And again, like, I don't think this is that hard to use on paper, but it still gives Moira a little bit more fun factor trying to aim an orb, even if it isn't the hardest thing in the world. So that's kind of like, pretty basic general stuff for it. I also have the experimental orb, the purple one, which, I gotta be real, I'm definitely open to suggestions here, and we'll talk about it, but the allied effect that I came up with is that if she hits an ally with the experimental orb, it's a very short movement and firing speed up. Basically, she can fire it early in a fight to kind of augment, an ally just for a little bit. Like, and when I say a little bit, I really do only mean like a second or two. Just very, very, very short. If it hits an enemy, again, very short, it's going to be a single target anti. So it would only last for a couple seconds, not as long as Bionade, which I see more as for denying one ability, basically. It's on it, like, you see somebody is probably going to take a lot of healing. Maybe you hit them with the anti just for a split second while they're trying to get healed, while their team is trying to save them. And then it goes right away. Like, it just denies one thing. It may even just deny, like, one instance of BAP healing. Or maybe two, because of how much is time in between them. But that would be perfect, right? It's a great amount of value, and then it goes away. It's not annoying. You don't have to sit behind a corner for a million years like Ana waiting to peak. It'll just go away super quick. Again, I'm not, like, super sold on this idea. I'd love to hear some other ideas for what the enemy effect might be, or even the allied effect. I had the idea in my head that it could be a cleanse, but I don't like that. Too many cleanses in the game as it is already. So we'll go ahead and we'll keep the movement speed and the firing speed. Basically, this gives Moira a little more, I hate to use the word utility, because I think damage and healing are also still directly or indirectly utility, but it gives her a little more decision making and other things that she can do in the fight. It gives her more unique playmaking potentials, but again, I am a little open to suggestions on this one. I'm going to get into a couple of problems and alternatives with this later on, because I do think there's putting this much power into one ability, because remember, you choose which orb you throw, and they're on the same cooldown, so putting that much power into it may shift the balance a little bit, so we'll talk about some alternatives to that. Next, we have Fade, which I think Fade is really annoying on live, but trying to rework Fade, I do think that her survivability is a big part of her kit, and I don't want her just to be this, like, super hard sustain character with her healing. So I do think Fade being in her kit is pretty key to this character, just like the cloak and the mistiness of Moira. So think of it now like it functions like a Genji dash, just not without damage, right? It goes a set distance the way you are looking, omnidirectional, whatever you choose. Basically, it keeps the instant invulnerability, but it removes that insane range of motion, and it removes the idea that you can just hit the button whenever and then think about what you're going to do while you're in Fade. No, not anymore, right? You have to go into engages thinking about your escape, and you have a good escape tool, but it is much more thoughtful, and just that extra amount of time you have to take to turn around and get yourself into, the right angle and look at the right spot could be the difference between life or death. Moira on live could just be taking damage and just hit the eject button and not even think about it, not even know. Moira now would have to do a little more more thought behind it and encourage her having a plan. It's still very powerful. It's still invulnerability. It would still be on a decently short cooldown like it is now, but I don't think it would be nearly as annoying as current Fade. Um, Again, I'm open to suggestions on this one. If you have any other ideas of how to make it a little more interesting, I do think it is kind of boring, even though it is omnidirectional, which gives Moira more options more consistently to get around and set up during a fight. But Moira doesn't really need to set up. So yeah, I don't know. That's Fade. And then Cole. Cole is pretty similar to how it is, but I do think that it being able to heal and damage at the same time is a little boring. At least just like the mini game that you play during Cole is to just try and line up as many people at once. And at some points it's just kind of, not as engaging as it should be. So what I had the idea of is that what if instead of it doing both at the same time, you swapped between healing and damage. So there's a little gap between every time you swap. But then the first instance of when you swap does a little bit more burst damage, or burst healing. So you actually have a little more potential to make a play, and then the sustain of it and the sustain of the damage is less. So you can put more into like the skillful aspect of like when do you swap beams and how many times do you swap beams over the course of Coalescence, rather than just holding the button and just keep holding and tracking and tracking. There's a little more thought behind it. This also means that, Moira can... it's more viable for Moira to just ignore the team if she wants to do damage, or she can just use it purely as defense, or she could use it as both, right? She could use it offensively to help her team, and then if her team get topped up, she doesn't just have to, like, watch them be full health. She can go swap to the damage and start doing that. Like kind of how her moment-to-moment, primary and secondary fire are. That's kind of the idea that I was going for here. Incorporate that more into the ult, because the ult does last a couple seconds, and you want to keep that nice moment-to-moment gameplay flow. If Moira just kept Coalescence as it is, I think that's perfectly fine. I think Cole is a decently good ultimate. It's a little boring, but I don't think it's like a problem by any means. This would just make it, I think, a little more engaging and a little more thoughtful. But yeah, that's kind of the whole rework. It's really not that much at the end of the day. I think most of it just comes down to how orbs work. I think the orb is the support equivalent of like place and forget, like a turret or something. Orb, you just kind of throw it into the sky, and then you just kind of walk with it until it goes away, and then it's gone, and like that's all you do, right? So that's kind of the kit. We'll talk about a couple alternatives. Originally I had a version of the regular heal, like her piss, where you could hold it, and basically it would do what the stable orb does. I kind of moved that over to the ability because I think it felt better. It would feel weird having like to only ever feather the piss, or else you would start charging. But I think there is some merit to Moira having some more to her primary and secondary fires. I couldn't really think of any like good ideas that worked with what I came up with and didn't just give her so much more extra. But I definitely think that you could add a little more flavor to primary and secondary fire. So yeah, I do think it could be too complicated with the orb doing 4 different effects, and you have to pick one of 4 things that it does. A way to alleviate this is to maybe have orbs stored, so they don't, she has, like charges of orbs, or maybe it's just on like kind of a lower cooldown, or stable and experimental could be on their own separate cooldowns as well. I'm open to all of that. Again, that's kind of more of like a balance thing. You'd have to make sure nothing is too overpowered and that she's just using orbs all the time, getting so much value. They'd have to do less than, what her current orbs do. But, Moira being able to do more things, just makes her more engaging, and she'd be able to make more plays. And since, again, like I emphasized that a lot of the effects are very short, I think her being able to use them more often would would be better. I do like the idea of having them both on their own separate cooldown. I think that's probably a good compromise because you still get to choose whether you use it for each orb for an ally or an enemy. So there's a lot that goes into it. I'm also open to dash being on a decently short cooldown or have a charge store. Less so because of the invulnerability, but Moira may not have that sustain anymore, and her survivability is lower. So being able to flank and do her own thing, it may not be as viable, and she may, I think Moira should be able to have different options to play. She shouldn't just stay with the tank or stay hyper on a flank only. So carefully considering making sure Moira has multiple different styles of play with her kit. But yeah, that is what I came up with. I do think if Moira was just left in the game right now forever, as she is, it's fine. Moira's kind of boring. She's only meta here and there when her numbers are good or when, the system mechanics favor her more. So, I'm not opposed to having to play with and against Moira. She's just a little annoying to fight, and a little boring to play as. But, I do want to hear your thoughts. What do you think of this rework? If you would keep her exactly as she is, maybe you would decide to just completely change her kit entirely. New kit, maybe you want to delete her. I don't know. Please let me know down in the comments below while you're at it. Any of the other good YouTube stuff. Really does help me out. I do really appreciate it. I do these discussions live on my Twitch every time I go live. That's twitch.tv/Lane Hemingway if you want to get in on this discussion. If not, the rest of my socials are down below. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.